Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for coming. As Professor Conrad mentioned, I wrote earlier an article on the question of monogenesis, or Adam and Eve. Some geneticists had argued that the idea of an original couple who were ancestors of all modern human beings was inconsistent with genetic evidence that the human population could never have been merely two individuals. I argued in reply in that article that if God had infused rational souls into two members of a larger animal population with which the two individuals continued to interbreed and infused such a rational soul into the descendants of those two, then there would be an original couple at the level of full rational humanity, but there would not be a genetic bottleneck. Would it be possible to put a rational soul into an animal body? This paper is an attempt to answer that question. So, the idea that man has an animal ancestry predates Charles Darwin's evolutionary ideas by half a century. It was explicitly articulated in both of the major works of early 19th century evolutionism, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck's Philosophie zoologique in 1809, and Robert Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation in 1844. Darwin made only 3 passing references to human origins in his work on the Origin of Species in 1859, but the implication of animal origins was there and no one missed it. Oxford Anglican Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, in an anonymous review of the Origin, wrote that if Mr. Darwin can demonstrate to us our fungular descent, we shall dismiss our pride and avow with the characteristic humility of philosophy our unsuspected cousinship with the mushrooms. By the time Darwin published The Descent of Man in 1871, 3 more books explicitly defending evolutionary anthropogenesis had already been published. Thomas Henry Huxley's Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature, Carl Voigt's Vorlesungen über den Menschen in 1863, both, and finally Giovanni Canestrini's Origine dell'Uomo in 1866. Although many Catholics, evolutionists and anti-evolutionists alike, denied that theories of evolutionary phytogenesis or zoogenesis, whether true or false, have any theological significance, the same was surely not true of the question of whether evolutionary processes played a role in anthropogenesis. So we're going to do a little bit of historical background, see what some of the Catholic objections were. The first official Catholic notice of the idea of evolutionary anthropogenesis came at a provincial council held in Cologne in the spring of 1860 in the context of a much more general review of Catholic doctrine on points ranging from the Trinity to the theology of nature. It declared that our first parents were made immediately by God. Therefore, clearly opposed to Scripture and to faith is the opinion that man, even considering only his body, was brought forth by the spontaneous change of a less perfect nature into a more perfect one in a way that is continuous and culminates in human nature. Although one might think that coming the year after the publication of Darwin's Origin, the Council's statement was responding to that book, there are good reasons for thinking that that's historically incorrect. First, Heinrich Georg Bronn's German translation of the Origin was only being published as the Council met. Second, that translation had in its very title a phrase that minimized the relevance of the book to anthropogenesis. The title that Bronn used was over the origin of species in the plant and animal kingdom. Finally, there is a more likely target of the statement of the Council, namely Chambers' Vestiges, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. Voigt's German translation of that had been published in 1851, with a second edition released in 1858, just 2 years before the Council. Chambers seems to have suggested precisely the kind of mixed evolutionary creationist account of anthropogenesis rejected by the Council, and I'll return to Chambers' ideas in a few minutes. Whether the doctrine articulated at Cologne precludes any evolutionary account of the origin of the human body, as some Catholic anti-evolutionists have been insisting now for 160 years, or whether it's more narrowly focused on continuist, non-providentialist, and non-exceptionalist versions of evolutionary anthropogenesis is a question that we can set aside here. A comprehensive rejection of any form of such anthropogenesis surely was the view of many Catholic theologians. Early on, some theologians claimed that the evolutionary view was heretical. By the turn of the century, the more common that is, turn of the 2 centuries back, by 1900, the more common evaluation was that the idea was merely rash. What concerns did Catholic anti-evolutionists have about evolutionary anthropogenesis? Surely part of the problem was created by the fact that evolutionary ideas generally kept bad company. So Carl Vogt, Thomas Henry Huxley, Clémence Royer, Darwin's first French translator, Ernst Haeckel, his most prominent German promoter, all those people divided their time between arguing for evolution and denying traditional theological doctrines, not just narrowly connected, but more broadly. There were, however, also more focused theological concerns. First, Catholic anti-evolutionists were generally insistent that evolutionary anthropogenesis was in ineliminable tension with the text of Holy Scripture and with the interpretation of the relevant passages of Scripture found in the Fathers. To be sure, St. Augustine had cautioned against excessive anthropomorphism in the reading of the very text at the center of the controversy. St. Augustine said, to think that God molded man from the slime of the earth with bodily hands is childish. Anyone in his right mind understands that the name of a bodily member, in passages in which one is found, is used for the power and might of God. Man's preeminence lies in the fact that God made him to his own image. One shouldn't, said St. Augustine, take finxit, the word in the old Latin translation of the Bible that he was using. You shouldn't take finxit, word that has strong connotation of working with one's hands, so literally. So Catholic evolutionists thought the same thing about limos, slime. They might have said, to think of God as making man directly from the slime of the earth underestimates the reach of secondary causes. Anyone who's knowledgeable of the facts uncovered by modern science would see that the phrase slime of the earth has been used in this passage to mean matter generally. Catholic evolutionists may not have demanded literal slime, but they were certain that the word excluded animal bodies. This hermeneutical question won't be explored further here. A second concern was that Adam's descent from animals seemed to offend against the dignity of man. In what's perhaps the last major work of Catholic anti-evolutionism, published in 48 in the original translation. I said that, but then say, no, I see some new Catholic anti-evolutionism coming out of Poland and so on. So, what was once the last major work, Ernesto Cardinal Ruffini wrote, who will be ready to believe that Adam had for his father and mother two brute beasts? Although innocent and holy, he would certainly have been in a much less honorable condition than is ours. This persistent concern received an early reply from Filippo de Filippi, whom I'll introduce later. In an appendix to the published version of his 1864 lecture, L'Uomo e le Scimmie, he wrote, to think that the origin of man is perhaps less divine when the biblical clod of earth turns out to be in the entire organic world is a strange way of understanding human dignity. Some Catholics articulated a third concern, which a Jesuit philosopher, Charles Boyer, expressed as follows. Let's suppose that some animals have reached the limits of the sensible order. I say they would not be able to generate a human body. And in the same text, only bodies animated by an intellectual, spiritual soul can engender bodies capable of being animated by an intellectual soul. It's this philosophical objection that will be the particular focus of this paper. Having pointed to those objections, I want to begin by acknowledging that even from the 1860s, not all Catholics were as anti-evolutionist as the ones just mentioned. Or was were the fathers of the Council of Cologne. So Saint John Henry Newman, for example, wrote in his notebooks, it's strange that monkeys should be so like men with no historical connection between them as the notion that there was no course of facts by which the fossil bones got into the rocks. I'll either go the whole hog with Darwin or, dispensing with time and history altogether, hold not only the theory of distinct species, but that also of the creation of fossil-bearing rocks. Catholic philosophers, scientists, and theologians, from De Filippi and St. George Member through Zeferino Cardinal Gonzalez, Dalmau Leroy, and John Salm to Henry Henri de Doledo and Ernest Messenger, over the course of the next 80 years offered defenses, if not in every case of the fact of evolutionary processes playing a role in the formation of the first human body, and at least of the compatibility of that idea with Catholic theology. By the end of the 19th century, two Catholic alternatives to the view that God formed Adam's body from the slime of the earth, or in a more polite version, from dust, had emerged. I'll get to those in a moment. But first, to answer the question of whether it's possible to integrate the idea of evolutionary origin of the human body into a more comprehensive Catholic account of anthropogenesis, we must begin by exploring some background considerations, constraints that an acceptable solution must satisfy. What evolutionary processes are, according to the best scientific evidence available? What kind of being, according to Catholic anthropology, do they have to produce? So, the evolutionary processes. The transformative processes in question would be the genetic mutations that effect something new in an individual animal and its offspring, or in a process such as natural or sexual selection, or the founder effect that spreads this change through an entire population. That the mutations would be biologically random does not preclude its subsumption under divine providence. What about the Catholic side? What doctrines must an account of evolutionary anthropogenesis accommodate if it's to remain consistent with Catholic theology? The first doctrine is that man's a composite of material body and rational soul, which is a soul which is truly in itself and essentially the form of the human body. That doctrine was articulated at the Council of Vienne in 1312 and again at Lateran V in 1513. Although Catholic anthropology is quite explicitly non-materialist, it's also opposed to the dualism that's a central feature of Platonism. Not only is the soul not a prisoner in a corporeal prison, it's not even the pilot of a ship, or, though Gilbert Ryle's image is perhaps vaguer, a ghost in a machine. St. Gregory of Nyssa, in objection to the idea of transmigration of souls, wrote that some people think, well, starting that about halfway through what I'm going to read, some people think that one and the same soul becomes successively that of a man and that of an irrational being, changing bodies and forever passing as it pleases from one to another, from man to bird or to fish or to beast, and then back to man. Some people extend this nonsense even to bushes. Those who think that the soul migrates from one species to another neglect to make a distinction among the distinctive features of the various species, mixing everything with everything else, the irrational and the rational, sensible and insensible. To say that one and the same soul, now rational and intellectual, because it has our kind of body, could then lie in a hole with the snakes or flock with the birds or live underwater, or become something not even capable of sensation, is nothing other than to think that everything has the same nature. So what are the implications of that doctrine for a question? Ernest Messenger, the Catholic priest who wrote the most comprehensive theological defense of Catholic evolutionism in about 1930, cited a scholastic formula which he attributed to St. Gregory of Nyssa, that the nature of the soul is always proportional to the body. Messenger put the point as follows: the human soul cannot inform a body which is not human, that is, one which does not possess what is essential for a human organism, or more particularly, one which does not possess the organs, which are the essential seat of the higher organic faculties, or which does not possess a specific organization peculiar to these organs. The second doctrine is that every individual soul, and a fortiori the first, was directly created by God. That was a prevailing view among Catholic theologians. The question of whether to define the creation of the human soul as Catholic doctrine had been raised at Vatican I in response to the Traducian alternative that had been advanced by Jakob Froschhammer and Blessed Antonio de Rosmini Serbati earlier in the century. The proposal met to define the doctrine met with some resistance, and the matter had not been resolved before the fall of Rome and the prorogation of the council. Nevertheless, the creation of the soul was accepted by all Catholic evolutionists and anti-evolutionists alike, and played no role in the Catholic controversy over anthropogenesis. The question of the origin of the human body was standardly treated as a distinct question in theology textbooks addressing the topic of creation. And the third doctrine is that human beings and animals are different, not just in degree, but in kind. There is, to use the words of St. John Paul II, an ontological discontinuity between the two. As signs of distinctively human being, he mentions metaphysical knowledge, self-consciousness, moral conscience, freedom, and aesthetic and religious experience. These signs, John Paul went on to say, must be subjected to philosophical analysis. At the root, on the traditional Catholic analysis, is rationality, the powers of intellect and will, and their acts, concept formation, judgment, and inference, and intention and choice. The idea that man can apprehend concepts as well as perceptual images, while animals, by contrast, cannot, can be illustrated by three examples. J.R.R. Tolkien put it this way: the human mind sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things, but sees it as green, as well as being grass. René Descartes illustrated the human faculty of conceptualization in contrast to imagination, which is to some extent within the reach of animals, this way. When I imagine a triangle, I don't merely understand that it's a three-sided figure, but I also see the three lines with my mind's eye as if they were present to me. If I think of a heliogon, by contrast, although I understand quite well that it's a figure with 1,000 sides, I don't imagine the 1,000 sides or see them as if they were present to me. Finally, a few months ago, this interesting photograph appeared in the newspaper from Congo's Virunga National Park. Two gorillas imitating the posture of one of the park's rangers. Innocent Bruanumwe, deputy director of the park, explained the behavior by saying that since the gorillas had been raised by rangers, they're considering those rangers are their parents. Well, I mean, it's a reasonable way to put what he wanted to say, but nobody thinks that gorillas have a concept of a parent, to something which they recognize other instances. So there's the ground for the difference in kind between man and animal. A moment ago I said that the two Catholic versions of evolutionary anthropogenesis had emerged by the end of the 19th century. Adding those to the ordinary version, we can distinguish three families of theories. Family number one is the Darwin-Chambers family. It encompasses theories in which evolutionary processes are sufficient to account for the origin of the human race. There are important differences between the evolutionary views of Robert Chambers and Charles Darwin, but they share the idea that evolutionary processes of the kind that gave rise to new species of plants and animals were fully capable of producing human beings from other animal species. These accounts of man and his origins are inconsistent with Catholic doctrine on 2 points. The first point of contradiction is the body-soul composition of the human person. Darwin, following his usual practice of avoiding theological and metaphysical questions, seldom used the word soul. Near the end of The Descent of Man, however, he acknowledged that he who believes in the advancement of man from some lower organized form will naturally ask, how does this bear on the belief in the immortality of the soul? Darwin contents himself, however, in his reply with denying that there is anything particularly irreligious about his theory, and doesn't address the question of the existence of human souls. Chambers, some years earlier, had addressed that question, and here's what he said. There is, in reality, nothing to prevent our regarding man as specially endowed with an immortal spirit, at the same time that his ordinary mental manifestations are looked upon as simple phenomena resulting from organization, those of the lower animals being phenomena absolutely the same in character, though developed within much narrower limits. So, according to Chambers, souls there may be, though not the kind of souls that constitute the ground of distinctly human powers. Chambers in souls not being the form of the human body are less than what's required by Catholic doctrine. The second point of contradiction is on the question of human exceptionalism. In The Descent of Man, Darwin said there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. Anti-exceptionalism, if not essential to Darwin's scientific project, that is, the defense of common ancestry and natural selection, was important to many Darwinists' philosophical project. The importance of this thesis to the larger, that is, extra-scientific project of many evolutionists is suggested by two comments of Stephen Jay Gould on the difference between Darwin and Wallace with respect to the origin of the human race, because Wallace thought at a certain point God, some spirit, stepped in and finished off the task that natural selection couldn't do. This is what Gould had to say about that. If Darwin had been distressed by his failure to impress Wallace with sexual selection, he was now positively aghast at Wallace's abrupt about-face at the finish line itself. And also, Gould said, Wallace abandoned natural selection at the most crucial moment of all. Those are very curious phrases, I thought. What could it mean to call a purely evolutionary origin of man? What would it mean to call that the purely evolutionary origin of man, rather than say the truth about the origin of man as the finish line? The thesis of endowed immortal spirits might appear to make Chambers' view an exceptionalist one, but it does so only at the cost of introducing a dualism inconsistent with the doctrine of Vienne. Chambers is quite clear, if not always entirely consistent, in asserting that with respect to human powers, including mental powers, there's no difference in kind between man and animals. Here he is again. The difference between mind and the lower animals and in man is a difference in degree only. It's not a specific difference. The grades of mind are mere stages of development in the humbler forms, but a few of the mental faculties are traceable in man. The system has arrived at its highest condition. So the immortal spirit, if it exists, seems at best to be something merely inserted into the human body without giving that body any of its powers that are part of its human nature. So what about the more Catholic versions? Here's what I call the second family, De Philippi Mivart family. Catholic evolutionists were explicitly evolutionist. Catholic evolutionism could also easily accommodate the second of the doctrines mentioned above, namely the direct creation of each human soul. How that creationism about the soul can be combined with the first doctrine, that is, the human person is a hylomorphic composite of body and soul, however, requires careful consideration. The infusion of a created rational soul into a body which evolved from animal ancestors might raise no problems for a Platonist, but it would not be, in the words of St. Gregory of Nyssa, a soul, or would it not be what he called a soul adapted to a strange building? That was a phrase of his. He didn't use it explicitly in criticism of something exactly like evolutionism. But wouldn't this be a problem? Could a Catholic accept the combination of evolution and infusion? Could a Thomist? Some Catholics thought that they could. Two Catholic biologists, Filippo de Filippi and St. George Jackson Mivart, articulated a version of anthropogenesis combining an evolved human body with a soul that is the locus of distinctively human powers in a way that it is not for Chambers. De Filippi, 1814 to 1867, was one of the leading Italian naturalists of his day. His research ranged from parasite worms and the embryology of fish to paleontology and mineralogy. Professor of zoology and director of the Zoological Museum at the University of Turin, he also found time for both popular science writing and for reflection on the relationship between science and religion. He was a sincere and practicing Catholic. His 1864 lecture, L'Uomo e le Scimmie, Man and Apes, did much to launch the debate over Darwinism in Italy. Mivart was an English anatomist and a systematic zoologist. Originally a student of Huxley and a member of the Darwin Circle, he gradually developed an evolutionism of his own. His view was, of course, controversial, but not so much so as to prevent Henry Cardinal Manning from recommending that Mivart receive an honorary doctorate from the Vatican. That recommendation was accepted by Pope Pius IX, and the degree was awarded in 1876. Both De Filippi and Mivart were evolutionists in the sense that they accepted the idea that the origin of species lies in the transformation of other species. They differed, however, on one scientific point. De Filippi accepted a prominent role for natural selection. Mivart, by contrast, did not, attributing evolutionary development rather to natural laws for the most part as yet unknown. That difference is not, however, important for our purposes here. This account of anthropogenesis was most explicitly presented by Mivart in his book on the Genesis of Species, published in 1871, just before the Descent of Man appeared. Its key idea is the evolution of a suitable body followed by the infusion of a created soul. So, here's how he phrased it. Scripture says that God made man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. This is a plain and direct statement that man's body was evolved from pre-existing material, symbolized by the term dust of the earth, and was therefore formed by the operation of secondary laws. And the soul of every individual man is created, that is, produced by direct or supernatural act, and of course, by such an act, the soul of the first man was similarly created. The contrast with Chambers becomes more explicit in a passage in which Mivart wrote, we find a perfect harmony in the double nature of man, his rationality making use of and subsuming his animality, his soul arising from direct and immediate creation, and his body being formed at first, as now in each separate individual, by derivative or secondary creation through natural laws. By such secondary creation, all the various kinds of animals and plants have been manifested on this planet. Chambers can say no more than that a soul is inserted into a human body. For Mivart, a soul is infused into a body. It's not merely an endowment, but a substantial form. There's no doubt that Mivart was an exceptionalist, but De Filippi, less explicit about infusion, offered a particularly explicit account of exceptionalism. Let's begin with this point that to say that man is descended from an ape is to do more than to express an anatomical fact. It's perhaps too easy to read his statement with an emphasis on the word fact. It would, I think, express his larger view equally well, perhaps better, if the emphasis were put rather on the word anatomical. It's just an anatomical fact. I wasn't at the lecture in 1864, so I don't know, but I mean, it seems consistent with his view to place the emphasis there. De Filippi's second point, and in his view, one even more important than the first, was that there is more to man than anatomy. The correspondences between man and ape with respect to structure are of less significance than the differences at the level of instinct and intellect. So here's his words. The more we reduce the physical inequalities between man and ape, the more the inequalities that remain, the differences in powers grow in importance. The place of man in nature must be determined not by the more or less of morphological characteristics subject to variation within the narrow confines of a species, but by comparison to the powers proper to man with those of animals. De Filippi emphasized those differences. When the naturalist thinks he can resolve the question of whether the difference between instinct and reason, or between animal and human reasoning, by asserting that man and animal have the same power, or that there's nothing in one that's not in the other, then he'll see common sense advancing against him like a heavy phalanx, and will have to cede the field of battle. The differences that everyone recognizes, he said, are sufficient to justify the establishment of a separate human kingdom alongside those of minerals, plants, and animals. The legitimacy of that kingdom cannot be disputed. Those who accept it and those who reject it both confirm it. For all of man's distinctive attributes, two are the most certain. One is that of putting himself in question, and the other is a struggle with his own feelings. The coat of arms of the human kingdom, he said in the last words of his lecture, contain the double crown of the moral and the teleological order. So, the third family that I want to call Catholic evolutionism, but with some qualifications and reservations about Wallace, who's not, of course, Catholic. So in a certain way, I'm emphasizing Cardinal Gonzalez, but want to acknowledge a similarity between his views and Wallace's, a similarity that Gonzalez also noticed, despite the differences, which I'll also mention. So we also have to distinguish this third view, not as fully evolutionary as the De Filippi Mivart view was. On this view, in this third view, the human body is partially, but only partially, the result of evolutionary processes. That view was elaborated in one way by the non-Catholic Alfred Russel Wallace, and in another way by Ceferino Cardinal Gonzalez. Wallace, co-discoverer of the principle of natural selection, differed with Darwin in several respects. First, Darwin was not as absolute a selectionist as was Wallace. In the last words of the introduction to The Origin of Species, Darwin had written, "I'm convinced that natural selection has been the main, but not the exclusive, means of modification." Wallace thought that natural selection had probably sufficed to produce all the varieties of structure, all the wonderful adaptations, all the beauty of form and color that we see in the animal and vegetable kingdoms. In 1869-70, in an anonymous review of the 10th edition of Charles Lyell's seminal Principles of Geology, Wallace indicated a second difference. He argued briefly there and later in more detail in an essay called The Limits of Natural Selection as Applied to Man, which later became the final chapter of his contributions to the theory of natural selection, that natural selection was not sufficient to produce several important human features. With respect to the mind, he wrote, "Primitive peoples possess a mental organ beyond their needs. Natural selection could only have endowed savage man with a brain a little superior to that of an ape, whereas primitive man, actually possesses one very little inferior to that of a philosopher." So, what are those human faculties of no possible use to man in his early stages, and thus beyond the reach of natural selection? Wallace mentioned the capacity to form ideal conceptions of space and time, of eternity and infinity, and abstract notions of form and number, which rendered geometry and arithmetic possible. He then asked, how could natural selection or survival of the fittest in the struggle for existence at all favor the development of mental powers so entirely removed from the material necessities of savage man, and which even now, with our comparatively high civilization, are in their farthest developments in advance of the age, and appear to have relation rather to the future of the race than to its actual status? In other words, in his large and well-developed brain, primitive man possesses an organ quite disproportionate to his actual requirements, an organization that seems prepared in advance only to be fully utilized as he progresses in civilization. We must therefore admit that the large brain he actually possesses could never have been solely developed by any of those laws of evolution whose essence is that they lead to a degree of organization exactly proportionate to the wants of each species, never beyond those wants. Darwin contented himself with trying to show that animals had inchoate versions of all allegedly distinctive human traits, and with emphasizing the power of sexual selection. This brings us to a third difference between Wallace and Darwin. Wallace was a spiritualist, not a Christian, or at least not in any strongly noticeable sense. Let me lost my place. He was a spiritualist, and that spiritualism served him as the foundation of an alternative explanation of the origin of the human body. The brain of prehistoric and savage man seems to me to prove the existence of some power distinct from that which has guided the development of the lower animals through their ever-varying forms of being. He later called this power superior intelligence and drew an analogy to artificial selection. Superior intelligence has guided the development of man in a definite direction and for a special purpose, just as man guides the development of many animal and vegetable forms. This is still, however, a direction of the action of the laws of variation, multiplication, and survival, not a suspension of them. In his concluding remarks, He added that his theory merely shows, I'm quoting him here, is it there? Yes. Merely shows that the laws of organic development have been occasionally used for a special end, just as man uses them for his special ends. The law of natural selection cannot be said to be disproved if it can be shown that man does not owe his entire physical and mental development to its unaided action, any more than it is disproved by the existence of the poodle or the pouter pigeon, the production of which may have been equally beyond the undirected power of natural selection. Wallace also thought that there was a spiritual aspect of human beings, though in this he was essentially a dualist. Spirit, he said, is the essential part of all sensitive beings, whose bodies form but the machinery and instruments by means of which they perceive and act upon other beings and on matter. It is spirit that alone feels and perceives and thinks, that acquires knowledge and reasons and aspires, though it can only do so by means of an exact proportion to the organization it is bound up with. It's a spirit of man that is man, and death it quits the body forever. So that's why I'm a little bit. It doesn't seem wrong to put Wallace and Gonzalez together, but there's a difference. I don't want to minimize. So Gonzalez articulated, though he did not explicitly endorse, a more Catholic version of this third line of evolutionary anthropogenesis. Wallace developed his version in response to what he perceived to be the scientific problems of what Darwin was about to defend in The Descent of Man. Gonzalez developed his version as a response to Mivart, whose views, though they could not be said to be contrary to Catholic doctrine, nevertheless had, Gonzalez thought, grave drawbacks and philosophical, scientific, and exegetical ones. He proposed consideration of an alternative juxtaposition of Mivart's hypothesis with a possibility noted by St. Thomas regarding the possibility that causes or agents other than God intervened in the formation of Adam's body, that is to say, in its preliminary preparation up to an imperfect stage of development, reserving the final stages of its preparation to receive a rational soul, reserving those to divine action. In this way, the essence of Mivart's hypothesis is preserved with due regard to the direct and immediate action of God in the formation of the body of the first man, action which traditional biblical exegesis seems to require. Although the idea that natural processes could not produce a human body might lead, as it had for Wallace, to the search for a preternatural alternative, the idea, that is, of divine action here, could be based on other grounds. Perhaps God supplemented natural processes with direct divine action in the formation of the human body, not because there was no natural way to produce a human body, but for some other reason. After all, he turned water into wine at Cana, not because the wine cellars were out of stock, but because his mother asked him to. Closer to our subject, the virgin birth might be explained as fitting rather than absolutely necessary. In any case, if, as Catholic anti-evolutionists claim, Scripture tells us that God played a direct role in the formation of the first human body, then that's what he did, whether we can identify his reason for doing so or not. In addition, as Wallace pointed out, to say that a superior intelligence played a direct role in the formation of the human body is not to say that secondary causes did not play any role at all. The Wallace-Gonzalez family is clearly distinct from the views of those Catholic and other anti-evolutionists who believe that God formed the body of Adam directly from the slime of the earth. So I want to make an appraisal of the three alternatives. Can Philippian Mivartist views be sustained against the objection of Boyer? Would the infusion of rational souls into an animal body like the transmigration rejected by St. Gregory also be a case of putting a rational soul into a strange building? If not, can we at least fall back on the alternative view of Wallace and Gonzalez that the human body is partially, but only partially, the product of natural evolution, or natural processes? Let's begin with a stronger view. Can evolutionary processes, in particular mutation and selection, produce and perpetuate bodies capable of laying the perceptual foundations for conceptual thought, that is, bodies into which rational souls can be infused? We can ask, that is to say, whether natural processes can get as far as De Filippi and Mivert require that they go. Two things are clear. First, that one natural process can do so, namely human zygosis and embryogenesis. Second, that the sense powers of some animals, being more complex than those of others, evolutionary processes must, though I'll not defend the point here, be capable of producing organisms with comparatively complex sense powers from organisms with comparatively simpler ones. For example, mammals from reptiles. If intellectual thought requires a created soul, then the question is not whether evolutionary processes can turn a merely perceptual species into an intellectual one. It's rather merely whether evolutionary processes can turn a species with perceptual powers insufficiently complex to underlie the abstraction of concepts, earthworms and gnats, if not also donkeys and cats, into one whose perceptual powers are sufficiently complex to allow such abstraction. So let's abstract ourselves from an admittedly more complex reality, kind of linear progression. On this continuum, we need to focus on 2 points. The minimum level of complexity necessary for the abstraction of concepts from percepts, that is the minimum level necessary for rational thought, and, second point, the maximum level of complexity attainable by evolutionary processes. So, what's the minimum level of perceptual complexity necessary for the abstraction of concepts? Mivert referred to a faculty of collecting, grouping, and preserving sensible images of objects in complex and coherent aggregations. That seems to be about right. We're going to just a moment. To get the concept of a triangle, we need to group diverse three-angled figures, equilateral and isosceles, acute and obtuse, large and small, and to differentiate them from, say, circles and rhombi. To get the concept of a horse, we need to group Bucephalus and Danpatch and Cleverhunts, the war horse, racehorse, circus horse. For mammals, we need to group dogs and horses, possums and platypods, dolphins and bats, differentiating them from sharks and robins. From what would a being without such a faculty be able to abstract concepts? And what would a being with such a faculty, or what more would a being with such a faculty need? What's the maximum level of perceptual complexity which evolutionary processes can produce? To see how much complexity those processes have produced, we need to turn to ethology. That science of animal behavior has flourished in the last half century. Many ingenious experiments have deepened our understanding of animal cognition. And here's what we find. Comparison. Surely any being with sense powers at all has some ability to sort out what it sees. Dogs learn to recognize porcupines and skunks and to leave them alone. Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfert have shown that vervet monkeys distinguish snakes, eagles, and leopards, making distinct warning calls depending on which is observed and reacting to the heard warning call appropriately. Animals can compare an image of what's present to remembered images and do what makes sense. Second, expectation. When a dog chases a cat up a tree, it knows that the cat's in the tree in the sense of having some kind of image of that cat in that tree. Many preferential looking experiments confirm that animals associate some of what they see happen with an expectation of what will happen next, as an upcoming slide or upcoming example will show. Third, association and grouping. Ron Schusterman taught his experimental subjects, sea lions, to sort the symbols he showed them in two groups. You can see the kind of symbols there. This is a fairly standard way of doing this kind of work. So the sea lion learns to sort the symbols into two groups, numbers and letters. So whatever appears in the middle is going to match one side or the other, and the sea lion, if he wants his fish, which he always does, picks the appropriate match. So, the sea lion can also assign new symbols to one group or another on the basis of these matching to sample exercises. The seals were able, that is to say, to construct functional equivalence classes, though of course they didn't really think of them as letters and numbers. Next, number sense. In preferential looking experiments, wild rhesus monkeys looked longer during presentations that violated the laws of addition than during those that were consistent with the laws of addition. So you can see what they set an eggplant out there, put the screen down, put another eggplant down there, pull the screen up, and if there's two there, well, the monkey is not surprised. But if they put a second one down and somehow they manage that there's only one is there when they left the screen, then that's not what the animal expects, and he looks longer. So in preferential looking experiments, wild rhesus monkeys looked longer during the presentations that violated the laws of addition than those that were consistent with the laws of addition. Concretely, they recognized the discrepancy between the number of eggplants that are placed into a screen box with the number of eggplants that were present once the screen was removed. So in that sense, we might call it a kind of number sense. Next, abstraction, not of concepts, but in the sense of ignoring particularities. The determination of numerosity can remain constant despite variation in object features such as size, color, or shape, spatial location, modality, that is auditory or visual, and mode of presentation, simultaneous or sequential. So, for example, a rat trained to press a lever on the left in response to 2 flashes or 2 sounds, and a lever on the right in response to 4 flashes or 4 sounds, spontaneously pressed the right lever when presented with a combination of 2 sounds and 2 lights. The rat's behavior was based on the abstract total of number of 4 events, not on modality-specific representations. I don't say it abstracted a concept, only that it abstracted in the sense of moved some way from the most immediate characterization of the stimulus. Next, and also particularly impressive, I think, is work of Irene Pepperberg with an African gray parrot named Alex, which, when shown collections of objects that varied in shape, color, and material like those, could answer not only simple questions like what color, but also how many red keys, and even what's different. 7th example, ordering. Brendan McGonigal and Margaret Chalmers showed that squirrel monkeys could solve transitivity problems using 5-member series. Taught to choose between adjacent pairs, choose A over B, choose B over C, etc. They extend their preferences to non-adjacent pairs. So having learned those two, they learn to choose A over C, which they've not been taught. Later, pigeons and rats were also shown capable of doing so. This maps transitive inference, that's the name, but it can be explained as a simple assignment of degrees of value. A's are very valuable, B's are not somewhat valuable, and C's are less valuable yet. In determining the significance of these results, we must, however, be sure to respect Lord Morgan's canon, the ethological application of Occam's razor, or Newton's rule number 2. I'll just read Lloyd Morgan. In no case may we interpret an action as the outcome of the exercise of a higher psychical faculty if it can be interpreted as the exercise of one which stands lower on the psychological scale. It forbids us from using the experiments mentioned above as evidence of conceptual thought in animals in the Thomistic sense of the word, because I think we can always explain it, those results without that. We can distinguish the categories, not in Aristotle's sense, which are within the reach of animals from the concepts as follows. And this is some ethological researchers said this: a category is an ability merely to discriminate a certain thing or kind or property, for example, color or shape, as opposed to a concept which involves a richer ability, not only perhaps to make certain discriminations, but also to reason about the thing and its relations to other entities of similar or different appearance or function. For example, to infer that something is colored and spatial from the fact that it's red. The cognition of categories, in this sense, suggests that evolutionary processes have brought animals some way towards a kind of complexity that's prerequisite to conceptual thought. On the question of where these 2 points are relative to one another, we can distinguish several possibilities. The more fully evolutionary views posited by De Filippi and Mivart require that evolutionary processes be able to produce sense powers at least complex enough to allow the abstraction of concepts. In other words, that abstraction needs no complexity beyond the reach of mutations, and perhaps no more than would be useful to a brute animal. Jesuit entomologist Felix Ruischkamp seems to hold this view in an article he published in 1939. He wrote, "The difference between man and animal lies not in the bodily, but only in the mental aspects of his nature. Our mind requires, for the formation of abstract concepts, sense perception and sensory centers in the brain, but nothing different from what animals, as beings with sense powers only, already have. Consequently, any creative intervention or patching up of the human body or brain would be superfluous. Since that level of complexity is only necessary and not sufficient for rational thought, that would not be sufficient to show that rational beings such as man could have evolved by natural processes. Rational beings would appear only with the creation of rational souls capable of actually doing the abstraction that the revolutionarily formed brains made possible." Would beings with that level of perceptual development in any sense require rational souls? Since the rational souls have to be created by God, the doctrine of divine freedom rules out anything like natural necessity here. There could, however, be a necessity of end. A rational soul might be necessary for individual survival if a mutation so changed an animal's sensitive powers that the animal could no longer function well or perhaps at all, unless it also had a rational soul capable of abstracting concepts from the images in its mind. Since human beings do, however, still have sense powers on which we rely in a way seemingly not dependent on our awareness of concepts, this logical possibility doesn't seem promising. Could such a soul be necessary in a weaker sense? A new degree of perceptual complexity might not be of much use if it weren't supplemented by an intellect. It might produce too little advantage to be favored by natural or sexual selection. If, by contrast, the augmented sense powers supplemented by rational powers did offer a selectable advantage, then the augmented powers might be selected in a way that would spread through a population and thereby transform the entire species. So the rational soul would be necessary for the spread of new degree of perceptual complexity to the entire population. Finally, an animal which had sensitive powers more developed than an animal would ever need or could even use in the course of an animal life might be able to live a full canine, simian, or cetacean life with its merely sensitive soul, but would have an untapped potential if it didn't have a soul also capable of abstracting concepts from the images which its sensitive soul produced. The infusion of rational soul into such beings would be possible in the way that it would not be possible in the case of a plant, and fitting in the sense that it would allow those animals to make fuller use of their sense powers. Such fittingness would not, however, require that God actually create a rational soul for every animal body developed enough to make such infusion possible. There might be reasons why God would choose not to do so. Perhaps it sufficed for God's purposes that only some of the animals with cognitive capacities developed enough to permit the infusion of rational souls would be. Perhaps it sufficed for God's purposes that only some of the animals with cognitive capacities developed enough to permit the infusion of rational souls would be converted into rational animals, just as it evidently sufficed for his purposes that only some mammalian lines developed into dogs and dolphins, while others were condemned to develop only into donkeys and cats. My account of monogenesis fits quite naturally with this idea of selective infusion. It's also possible, of course, that mutations selected and selection could take a species beyond the minimum, or even that it had done so. I think I'm going to not say more about that unless people are really curious about it. I only want to acknowledge that it might be possible. What is enough? I mean, if that's what's required, not this, but at least that previous slide for Mivert and De Filippi, what's enough for Wallace and Gonzalez? Perhaps evolutionary processes cannot get to the minimum level of complexity necessary for abstraction of concepts, leaving the gap between animal and man unbridgeable by evolutionary processes, in which case the proper diagram would be that. If that gap exists, divine intervention of the kind Wallace and Gonzalez suggested would be one way that it could be crossed. Something like this view was defended in the 1930s by Ernest Messenger and by Pierre-Marie Pellier. It's hard to see how there could be any scientific arguments against the idea that direct divine action played some role in the formation of Adam's body. There's no evidence on the question of what in fact caused any particular mutation. Whether God caused it directly or whether he caused it indirectly by causing radiation to affect it, or whether it was caused by fully natural processes is a question, the data to answer which we'll never have. So what connection do these ideas have with my earlier paper? Are both of the versions of Catholic evolutionism discussed above compatible with the interbreeding hypothesis, which I proposed a few years ago? The De Filippi Mivart family of views clearly is so. It was the kind of evolutionism which I had in mind. Are my earlier ideas also compatible with the Wallace-Gonzalez version? It might seem that they're not. The formation in question would presumably have to be more than just the formation of Adam's own body. It must have an effect that would be transmitted to all of his fully human descendants as well. All fully human beings, that is to say, would have to be genetic descendants of Adam, that is, carriers of the genes that were the product of the divine intervention, not merely his genealogical descendants. In other words, it would not be enough that all fully human beings have Adam in their family tree. They'd also have to have the crucial genes in their personal genome. Otherwise, they wouldn't be suitable for the infusion of the rational soul. Genetic descendants are merely a subset of genealogical descendants. Universal genetic ancestry could not be achieved as quickly as can universal genealogical ancestry. Either of two factors could, however, make the spread of the crucial genes to all humanity, even to the isolated populations living at the ends of the earth, sufficiently rapid to meet all theological, scientific, and historical concerns. The first such factor is that rationality might be sufficiently favored by natural or sexual selection to spread fairly rapidly through populations of reproductively human beings. That is the larger population within which the interbreeding occurred. The second is that the first rational beings might have lived so long ago that even a more slowly spreading mutation could have reached all reproductively human beings long enough ago to obviate this problem. There may be no reason to posit direct divine intervention in the formation of Adam's body, but the fact of such action, if fact it be, would not undermine the interbreeding hypothesis on which I relied to meet the objection to monogenesis on the basis of human diversity. So, by way of conclusion, I just want to say there seems to be no reason to think that evolutionary processes cannot reach a level of perceptual complexity sufficient to allow the abstraction of concepts. There's no reason to think that the construction of the body of a rational animal must begin from scratch. Animal behavior does show a modest ability to collect, group, and preserve sensible images of objects. It does not seem to go very far in the direction of complex and coherent aggregations, but it does go far enough to make plausible the idea that bodies with perceptual powers equivalent to those found in man might have been formed by purely evolutionary processes. I don't think I've made an argument as strong as I might have liked. It does seem to me I've shifted the burden of proof on to the other side. The principles of Christian naturalism articulated by Henri de Darlaudot a century ago suggest a presumption in favor of the natural evolution of the body of Adam. But even if the full attainment of the required level of complexity is beyond the reach of evolutionary processes, surely the product of those processes is close enough to allow completion by modest divine supplementary modification of an animal that is itself the product of evolution. So those are my thoughts. I'll be interested in hearing your questions or objections or further thoughts.